Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. We have now reached the 11th and then, inshallah, 12th introductory bab in the first introduction of Ibn Juzay's Tafsir. So there is not a great deal of complexity in what we're about to cover, inshallah. And if everything turns out to be straightforward in the translation, then perhaps this session will be slightly shorter than most. He says, with a great big inshallah. Right, so let's listen as we usually do to the reading by Sheikh Amr al-Busati.
يقول رحمه الله: الباب 11 في إعجاز القرآن وإقامة الدليل على أنه من عند الله، ويدل على ذلك 10 وجوه. الأول فصاحته التي امتاز بها عن كلام المخلوقين. الثاني نظمه العجيب وأسلوبه الغريب من مقاطع آياته وفواصل كلماته. الثالث عجز الخلق في زمان نزوله وبعد ذلك إلى الآن عن الإتيان بمثله.
Okay, so in the beginning we have within this chapter, which is of course about the concept of I'jaz al-Quran. So I'jaz, as we said before, and I'd forgotten that we were about to come to a bab specifically about this, but in the last session we did touch on this issue of I'jaz because we were talking about balagha, and as I pointed out to you, the field of balagha developed in the context of analyzing and being able to describe and being able to prove the I'jaz of the Quran, right? Which really I'jaz in and of itself means inimitability, right? So a mu'jiza in general is something that makes people unable to replicate it, right? Something which outdoes people, leaves them dumbfounded, leaves them without a response. So because ajiz is inability, incapacity, right? So it incapacitates people. So a mu'jiza is one instance of that. So we have throughout the stories of the prophets, peace be upon them all, the fact that they came to their people with mu'jizat, right? Sometimes the Quran is describing this as ayat, sometimes it's describing it as bayinat or ayat bayinat, and so on. But the word mu'jiza, although the root, that root does occur in the Quran, but not with this meaning, right? So it's become the sort of technical word that's used for a miracle. And in terms of the miracle of the Quran, again, the Quran is not using the word mu'jiz or i'jaz for that. But we have ayat which are presenting a challenge to people that let them come with the like of this Quran, or let them come with 10 surahs of its like, or let them bring a surah of its like. So this is a challenge that is put out, and this is not described with the word mu'jiza, or so this is the term that has been most applied to that. And sometimes they talk about tahaddi al-Quran, the tahaddi or the challenge of the Quran also. And the purpose of that is a couple of things. Number one, it is to convince people that this book is from Allah, or perhaps more precisely, it is to convince people and to support the claim of the Prophet who comes with a message, right? So when a Prophet comes and says, I am a Prophet from God, the mu'jiza is there to say, yeah, I'm supported by this miracle. And this is something khariq lil-'ada, something which goes against the norms of what is considered possible, something which seems to break the laws of nature altogether. And I say it seems to break the laws of nature because there's a bit of a point of investigation here. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala breaks the laws of nature, then in a sense they're not laws which are binding on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he is perfectly has every power and ability to do something in a different way from what he usually does. So at most, these are sunan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what we call laws, universal laws, are sunan of Allah. So in a sense, he can go against his normal sunnah or his way of doing things, what is normally possible or what is normally impossible, he can turn that into the possible and the reality, which you can call breaking the laws, but you know, it sort of depends how you look at it. That's what I'm saying. So khariq lil aada, the aada is not considered a law, like a qanun, it has to follow this pattern, but rather it is Allah's aada, and it's perfectly easy for him to do something in a different way from what he usually does. But we are expected to understand things as following laws, right? And so when something goes against it, we notice, okay, it is the creator of those laws who has, in a sense, violated them or disrupted them, and shown us that this person who is claiming prophethood has come with a true claim. And there's a lot of detail about that. How is the mu'jiza established? There has to be a claim. There has, there has to be not something that disproves, and so there's a whole set of things around that discussion in theology. But the basic point is the ayah or the mu'jiza is there to support the truth of the prophet who brings it, right? And he delivers that. With the Quran, you have an additional factor, which is the Quran is also the message. Right? So in most cases, you have the message and you have the mu'jiza which supports the message. With the Quran, you have the message and the mu'jiza are contained in the same vessel, or they consist in the same thing. So that is something specific about the Quran which makes it different from previous mu'jizat, but also different from previous scriptures. It's not necessarily the case that previous scriptures were mu'jiz, which is an interesting point to ponder on as well, but we'll leave it at that. So في إعجاز القرآن وإقامة الدليل على أنه من عند الله. So in the first place, it is supposed to convince the people that the Prophet is from Allah, and that the book itself is from Allah. As I said, this complication of message and miracle being wrapped up in one. And إقامة al-hujjah. So it's not really spelled out here, but it is elsewhere, that it's also establishing the proof against those people. So once they have seen that miraculous event, a miraculous happening, then it means that they will be held accountable for not believing in it, right? Because they have been shown some, a clear proof. Now with the Quran, of course, there is a difference between إقامة الحجة on the first people upon whom its effect would have been most obvious, right? Its impact would have been most intense and effective compared to people later, right? So إقامة الحجة on the first hearers, which is the most eloquent of Arabs, would have been a complete hujjah. And then there are people who might hear something about the Quran, they might read a translation of the Quran, hear distorted versions of the Quran, distorted translations, distorted explanations. So if hujjah is established on them, it's not on the same level as the hujjah established on the first hearers, right? So a point like that is made in point 3, right? Or a related point, let's say. Now we'd already touched on the fact that the main trend within talking about i'jaz became one which focused on the words and the meanings of the Quran. So in a way, that's like the first two, or even you could add the third point combined here together. So let's see the translation. First is eloquence, fasaha, right, is the word we used before for eloquence, or the other way around, which distinguishes it from the words of created beings. So of course, being eloquent is not in itself miraculous, but it's the extent of that fasaha. And here fasaha, it's sort of overlapping with what is meant by balagha, right? نظمه العجيب, its amazing arrangement. So nazm could refer to a few different things. In the works of Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani, which we referred to yesterday, the nazm is about how the words carry meanings. So it's the connection between the lafz, which is to say the wording, right? Even the string of words, this is the wording, and the meaning that those words contain, right? So the fact that there's so much meaning packed into these words, and these words are so effective and yet so concise, this is all a description of the nazm of the Quran. So he may mean that. Nazm otherwise could refer to sort of more like the structure, the way that the ayat flow from each other. I mean, later on, much later on, this is the way that nazm is used by the school of Hamiduddin Farahi. Farahi used the word nizam actually, and then Islahi, his student, used the word nazm in that kind of way. So it's not actually that strange to think that somebody could use the word nazm in that way before. If you look at the tafsir of al-Biqa'i, Burhanuddin al-Biqa'i, it's a very unusual kind of tafsir. It is based on this kind of idea of the connection between ayahs and the connection between the kind of the underlying communication that's going on through these ayahs and why one is followed by the other. His is called Nazm al-Durar. Nazm al-Durar because, you know, it's like pearls strung on a necklace, something like that, right? So that's the idea of nazm, is like interconnectedness between things, right? So Nazm al-Ajib can just mean the words and how those words carry meanings, and then how those words are connected to each other. All of that can be carried by the word nazm. Okay. Well, uslubuhu al-gharib, its way of expressions, style is a fairly good word for uslub. Al-gharib here, of course, not in a negative sense. It just means extraordinary. That's fine. Extraordinary style. من مقاطع آياته وفواصل كلماته. So that becomes closer to telling us nazm is something here about structure, right? So in the way it's sectioned in terms of its verses, and divisions of its words. So I'm not sure if he means this as two separate points. He might. So the word maqati' can refer to the end of the ayah. Fawasil is the more common word for the end of the ayah. We call it the fasila. He indicated before, maybe it was here. No, it was at the end of his chapter on mawaqif. He said something here. So he says that the ayat in the Quran, the end of the ayah, is like al-fiqr fi al-nathri, so it's like the end of the sentence or paragraph. Wal-qawafi fi al-shi'r, so the qafiya in shi'r is the ending of the line, right? So the kind of equivalent of that in Quranic structure is the ayah, or ra'sul ayah, the end of the ayah. And the ulama of Islam were not happy about using a word, the same word like qafiya. So they came up with the word fasila, right? So fawasil is the most common word used for, or sometimes just called ra'sul ayah, right? The head of the ayah, which is the end of the ayah. Maqati' I think is sometimes used in that same way, but it's also sometimes used for, but this is probably more in modern linguistics, it's used for syllables, something equivalent to syllables. Anyway, this translation kind of gets the point across, I think, just fine. Question: how well known is Islahi amongst modern exegetes? The Farahian school is a very particular one to the Indian subcontinent, and Farahi's work is some of it in Arabic, but hasn't been widely distributed in the Arab world. So it remains not very well known. Farahi's tafsir is only partial. He has a few standalone works that are very valuable in their own right, like Mufradat al-Quran, and have been recognized by Arab scholars, but still perhaps not as much as they could be. Islahi's tafsir is a complete tafsir, but it's in Urdu, right? It's in Urdu. It is here in my shelf, right? This is it. So it's in Urdu only, and has not been translated to Arabic. It's been partially translated to English. I don't know what other languages, but until that happens, then it's not going to be much discussed amongst Arab readers. Right. So the third point that he makes here is mankind's incapacity of producing the like of it at the time of its revelation until now. So this is two things in a way. So the time of its revelation was the main part of that challenge, right? Because if they could not do it, then it is not to be expected that anyone would do it thereafter. Otherwise, this point would not stand, because you could say, well, nobody managed to do it before, but they could still do it in the future. So the hujjah is not established. The hujjah would have to be established by ajul khalq fi zaman al-nuzul, right? And the rest is like the timma of the point. At the time of its revolution until now. Okay, and then it would be worth giving the Quranic references to that challenge, right? So then he goes on to some other things that also fall within the i'jaz of the Quran, or things which indicate its miraculous nature, or which indicate its divine origin. And I want us to see that as two related things, but slightly different things, right? If we just focus on i'jaz per se, we well, I don't know why I feel this point is important, but I think it is important just to understand that there are two discussions which are closely related but still somewhat distinct. One of them is establishing the i'jaz in what it consists, and the other one is how do we know, are we convinced ourselves, and how do we convince others that the Quran is from God, right? Because I think convincing people or convincing ourselves that it's from God is not exactly the same as proving a miracle, right? Proving the divine origin of the book is slightly different from saying it is miraculous, even though proving it's miraculous would be a proof that it's from God. But there may be things that are pointers to its divine origin that don't fall under a strict concept of a miracle. This is what I'd suggest. A very good book on this, but it's written in the, in the modern times, is by Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah Diraz. The book is called An-Naba'ul Azim. That's its Arabic title. Its English title, because there is a good translation of it, is The Quran, An Eternal Challenge. And that book has been very influential. It's an Azhari product, one which has had influence on subsequent writings in the subject. And the kind of points that he touches on are actually quite similar to what Ibn Juzayy mentions here. So that's quite interesting that Ibn Juzay's discourse is already going past just the issue of the fasaha and balagha, but going beyond that to other types of indications. And I don't know how much you find that with mufassirin or usuliyin or whatever it may be in our tradition. This could be just a shortness of my own readings, but I do find this interesting that Ibn Juzayy has actually touched on a range of things as evidences. Dalail Sidq al-Quran. So what's next?
الرابع ما أخبر فيه من أخبار الأمم السالفة والقرون الماضية ولم يكن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم تعلم ذلك ولا قرأه في كتاب. الخامس ما أخبر فيه من الغيوب المستقبلة فوقعت على حسب ما قال.
Okay, so this is to do with history and prophecies, right? So the history part is indicated by the Quran. Okay, that the Quran in some places, after recounting a story, says تِلْكَ مِنْ أَنْبَاءِ الْغَيْبِ نُوحِيهِ إِلَيْكَ or نُوحِيهَا إِلَيْكَ, depending which ayah we're reading. So let's take the one in Surah Hud. تِلْكَ مِنْ أَنْبَاءِ الْغَيْبِ نُوحِيهَا إِلَيْكَ ما كنت تعلمها أنت ولا قومك من قبل هذا So neither you nor your qawm, your people, were knew of this before this, right? So it is a challenge that the challenge is being made that, do you think that you know this? Well, you don't, right? You might be aware of some of what happened. So that comes after the story of Nuh alayhi salam. They may have been aware of certain details, but there are certain details which the Quran is bringing and saying to them, you were not aware of this. And perhaps other nations were aware of these things and can in a sense confirm that you are talking sense, right? But the Prophet ﷺ is not one of their students. And his people knew that of him, right? They knew that he's not studying from any one of them. So these kind of additional points are needed to sort of just complete the sense of the argument. But Ibn Juzayy has expressed it nicely in brief. وَلَمْ يَكُنِ النَّبِي. So it's like, in and of itself, just telling stories of past nations doesn't constitute a miracle. But then there's a lot of richness of explanation, as we indicated before, when talking about the usul related to qasas of Quran, the scope for re-evaluating the place of Israeliyat, what's the relationship between the Quranic stories and the biblical stories. We touched on some of this in a previous session. Potentially this could be as a place of exploration for this aspect of the miraculous nature of the Quran and indicating the divine nature of the Quran. How does it seem to touch on things that were, in a sense, hidden away in certain books? The Prophet ﷺ would not have had access to those. On the one hand, people are sort of saying, oh, well, the Quran is confused because it's not even quoting the Bible. Sometimes it's quoting obscure apocryphal texts, well, maybe that is actually the point. Maybe the Quran is bringing to light things that were sort of buried away or put under the table or whatever it may be. And there's a lot more that can be explored in that. So Al-Khamis, this is about telling things about the future. But notice here he's saying hidden incidents of the future, because the future is always ghaib, right? Which he prophesied, and they occurred according to what he related. So what's he here? If there's a he, it must be he subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there's no mention here of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If it was the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we could still understand it, because he is conveying the Quran and therefore he's informing them of things of the past, informing of the future. That's fine as a meaning. But what does he mean when he says ما أخبر فيه وَلَمْ يَكُنِ النَّبِيُّ. Okay, so but still, it's the wording seems to be I'm trying to think whether the dhamir can refer to the Quran itself, but it doesn't seem to make sense if you say مَا أخبر فيه. مَا أخبر فيه is another possibility, as Siddiq has noticed, but it just doesn't really also sound right, because also then it just doesn't sound very clear then. ما أخبر فيه من الغيوب المستقبلة. Yeah, well, in any case, if we have he, it should be capital H, he. But I'm not averse to rewording it so we don't have the he. But sort of turning it into it, just so that it becomes a little bit clearer in English. Because if you make it the he, I think the meaning sort of becomes a little bit, not obscured actually, but just a little bit unnatural in the way that it's being talked about in English. Keeping in mind that this is a kind of like, sometimes people criticize this, that in Western literature or in academia, we have practice of referring to the Quran, and this, the Quran says, and we attribute the speech to the Quran and not to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'm sure I've done that even earlier in this conversation. It's a matter of speech. It sometimes fits better within our sort of cultural frame, whereas in the Arabic cultural frame and generally in the Islamic cultural frame, it is much more natural to say قال تعالى في في هذه الآية, and to say in Arabic والقرآن يقول or قال القرآن, or it's very, very weird indeed. In English, it doesn't actually sound strange. So I think as long as a person is aware of that, it's not necessarily a problem. If maybe we're used to talking in certain academic contexts where you have to sort of speak somewhat neutrally about who is the author of the Quran. But if you do that too often, your heart can become hard, right? Or refers to when the Quran says Qul and the Prophet relates to the people. Yeah, so it could be that the Prophet is the mukhbir. Subject could be God, akhbar Allahu fihi. Yeah, so that's what I was saying when I made it a capital H. But still, the wording sounds a little bit strange if that's what it means. Sometimes things look strange and they're not strange, so you got to look at it with a fresh mind, different time of the day, after a coffee, something like that. Right, so talking about the past and talking about the future. So here he's not counting things that are prophesied that have not yet come true, because again, we don't have a way of saying that those are a miracle until they come true. And this is different and separate, of course, from scientific things, okay, because a subset in a way is if the Quran indicates some meaning and it's to do with some physical, natural phenomenon, observable phenomenon in the universe, or in the animal kingdom or in ourselves, and the reality of that is not yet known, or the way in which that is true is not yet known. And then later on, maybe in the 20th century, 21st century, we discover, something through scientific means, which confirms that what the Quran described is actually very apt. Okay, so that's where people use the term scientific miracles. And the word scientific, the expression scientific miracles is a bit strange, a bit of an oxymoron for something to be scientific and a miracle at the same time. But you understand what is being said here. It is, in a way, a kind of prophecy that there is something here which is not just accurate, but accurate in a way that is like impossibly accurate. How could someone have known that at that time? And then it takes some centuries or a millennium and a half until people then discover that what the Quran, in a sense, what it stated, but in a sense what it predicted, is in fact true. So scientific miracles was something that sort of surged in popularity in the last few decades, and has taken quite a turn for the worse in terms of the attitude of scholars towards it, and maybe even general people as well are turning against it, because it became a bit more obvious what's going wrong in this whole industry of seeking out scientific miracles. At least I will say, as a person in the field of tafsir, that a lot of what is involved in the scientific miracles discourse is really horrific in terms of what it does to tafsir. It pays no attention whatsoever to tafsir. It just generates its own tafsir for the sake of making its arguments. And those arguments are quite flimsy in terms of how they're structured, right? And one of the most obvious problems in this is if you then base the truth of that upon the truth of this scientific interpretation and scientific explanation, or scientific theory as it emerges in the 21st century, then that is open to being revised and demolished again in future, right? So that is a serious flaw in the scientific miracles discourse, but there are perhaps flaws even more serious than that. And there would be, if we do have time, but I don't want to dwell on this. Scientific miracles is something which, in principle, there could be a little bit of support for this, something like this. You have some mufassirin like Ibn Ashur, rahimahullah, who show some interest in that and indicate some support for that, but they are going to be cautious about that, and we should be very cautious about it, because it sort of glitters. It's all that glitters is not gold. If what it does is divert you from the actual meaning of the ayah towards a hypothetical meaning just to fit the point that you're trying to make, then you find that the i'jaz discourse is destroying our appreciation of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually saying to us, because we're so busy trying to prove something to somebody else that we are actually not paying attention to what is the meaning I'm supposed to appreciate from this. And actually what I'm saying here in relation to scientific miracles does to some extent apply elsewhere in the i'jaz approach, even if the i'jaz approach is valid and correct. But even when we are so busy trying to prove how fasih these words are, and there's no error in these words, when we're just spending our time focusing on that side of things, on that set of realities, we may lose sight of what tafsir involves. So the sort of bayan al-Quran versus exploring al-i'jaz al-bayani, these, although many, great scholars have done both at the same time, they are slightly at a tension with each other. So whether we're talking about Aisha Abdurrahman bint al-Shati, 20th century mufassira, she has got a tafsir al-bayani, or whether you're talking about Ibn Ashur, who I just mentioned, his tafsir can be seen as a big project of showing the intricacies and the beauty and perfection of the Quranic language. But it's kind of hard to do the two things at the same time. One is to just argue how perfect the words are, and the other one is to investigate what they mean, right? But you can do one next to the other, let's say. But maybe you'll get a better idea later on of what I mean by this kind of tension between the two things. Yeah, so as Sadiq noticed, the scientific miracle stuff was heavily popularized within the modern Dawah scene. But you see that some people have started to turn against it. I mean, one of the people who's written a good essay concerning this in English is Hamza Sources. And he has previously been someone who's argued for scientific miracles. But even before you go to Hamza, this person here also has written a bunch of stuff in the scientific miracles genre. There were some things that I wrote when I was about 17, 18 years old. I used to be a physics student. I used to study theoretical physics. And a little bit, even I was studying astrophysics at the University of Edinburgh. And then I just sort of fell out of love with physics. It was so maths heavy, and I wasn't coping very well. And I was just feeling much more inclined towards philosophy and linguistics. So I ended up changing course altogether. So physics to me is like quite a distant memory now. Certainly the mathematics side of it is completely a distant memory. But at that time, I was working on this stuff to do with scientific miracles as well. And some things that I wrote at that age for a local radio station then were, I posted them on a website that I had at that time. And then the materials from that website got lifted by a publisher in India, an unscrupulous publisher who I don't want you to support at all. Its name is Adam Publishers. They took my material. They might have tried to reach me and failed to reach me for permission, but anyway, they took it and they published it as a book with my name on it, which is the worst thing actually, because it can still be found. And I'm not encouraging you to look for it. I'm 100% not, and this is not reverse psychology, but do not buy this book. I implore you for the sake of Allah, do not buy that book. It is, it has a few actually good chapters even now that are just like reasoning and reasoning for the truthfulness of the Quran. And there are things about history, there are things about prophecies, but the scientific stuff is atrocious, really atrocious. First of all, it's basically just lifted from other places, although I rewrote things in my own words as far as possible, but at the same time, the ideas are not, scientific research, right? They're just taken from Dawah pamphlets and whatnot. And then that got published in a very sort of draft form. And then I started to negotiate with the publisher. When I found out about it a few years later, basically my older brother found it and said, "Is this you?" And I was like, I didn't know I have a published book, but I do since 2004. So they eventually, after a lot of pressure, paid out, a few rupees as royalties. And I said, look, but this is the condition that you've paid me now for the first edition, and there's to be no further editions of this book. Subsequently, I found out that they'd already produced another edition, and they are still reprinting it, and people are still, apparently, buying it. And it's a terrible book. Just absolutely do not waste your money on it, and don't support that publisher, because then they stopped answering my emails, completely unscrupulous. And this is what they call da'wah organizations, for the sake of Allah. They would rip off an author, disrespect his wishes. My main problem with the book, there are various things, but the main problem with it is I do not stand by what I said about the Quran in it. The interpretations, tenuous interpretations, stretched and strained interpretations, not from me, but things which I talked about for the sake of what was originally a local radio series in Glasgow. A few dozen people were probably listening at the time. But because I was kind of like, had some activity in me, I turned that into scripts which I posted online, and then they become a book. And since then, it's been selling for some reason. And now it's worse, because people will find my name from, the great exegesis of Tafsir Razi, and then they'll be like, oh, Amazon will tell them, oh, would you like also this other book by the author? And I don't know how to stop this. I can't get it. If you can get it banned, if anyone can get it banned, I will be full of gratitude to you. That is astonishing facts. So I have some painful background in this subject of scientific miracles. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I'm repentant of it, because my main concern really as a person in tafsir is, what is the meaning of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. And you just shouldn't come with preconceived notions or trying to force a certain narrative onto it. This is completely against what we do. Fadl Abbas, you're saying in the comments, it's a good chapter on pre-modern positions on the issue, Ghazali Razi. So I want to say that there's a difference between scientific tafsir and scientific miracles. So sometimes people talk about these in the same breath. I don't know if that's what you're talking about, because there's no scientific miracles, I think, in Ghazali or Razi. The Quran contains everything, including contentions of philosophers. Versus Ash-Shatibi. It doesn't contain everything as revealed for illiterate nation. Okay, so you're talking about a related issue. Yeah, maybe on some level we have an expectation that the Quran will be accurate with regards to what it says about the world and nature and cosmology and the rest of it. And perhaps aspects of that accuracy become clearer to us as students of tafsir as time goes on. And we can explain it based on the science of our day. And we can keep saying, based on current science, what we can understand these ayahs to mean is enhanced, right? So that's what we can call scientific tafsir. That can indeed be valid and correct and called for, right? With the caveat that, okay, the science I'm talking about is subject to further investigation, and therefore we're not going to say, in a qat'i sense, this is what the ayah means. But it's okay to say, well, based on our understanding, this is a good interpretation. This is a way we can understand what the ayah is pointing to, because the ayah is not something spoken by a 7th century Arab, or it's not like based on, it's coming from the creator of the heavens and the earth. So therefore, it can be valid to interpret it according to modern science, if you see my point, with all the caveats. But it's different to try to go from there to build a miracle argument upon it, because the miracle argument depends upon a whole set of other premises, right? Which is that nobody else at that time also knew this information, that there's no way that the Prophet ﷺ could have known that. We also have to be sure that the ayah is saying that if this ihtimal, as I say, إذا ثبت الاحتمال سقط الاستدلال, right? Once the ayah could mean this scientific meaning and it could mean something else, then we can't use it to prove the scientific miracle, because the argument can fall flat if just somebody says, well, the ayah could simply mean this other thing, right? So there's a whole set of things which complicate this search for scientific miracle argument in order to convince someone who's not a believer in order to become a believer. But as for things which we can study and increase our appreciation and lets us see how the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are open and admit for new meanings as new knowledge comes to us, well, that's a different thing, and that I think is valid in tafsir. So tafsir ilmi, okay. I'jaz ilmi, huge question mark and maybe a cross, right?
السادس ما فيه من التعريف بالباري جل جلاله وذكر صفاته وأسمائه وما يجوز عليه وما يستحيل عليه ودعوة الخلق إلى عبادته وتوحيده وإقامة البراهين القاطعة والحجج الواضحة والرد على أصناف الكفار، وذلك كله يعلم بالضرورة أنه لا يصل إليه بشر من تلقاء نفسه بل بوحي من العليم الخبير، ولا يشك عاقل في صدق من عرف الله تلك المعرفة وعظم جلاله ذلك التعظيم ودعا عباد الله إلى صراطه المستقيم.
Okay, so this is a very interesting argument, sort of different in style from the previous ones, but it's pointing to the content of the Quran, in particular its descriptions of the divine and his attributes subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the extent that a person is not able to just make this kind of stuff up, right? So when you appreciate what the Quran is saying, what the Prophet ﷺ is conveying when he's reciting the Quran to people of Allah's names, his perfection, you don't think, okay, he's just making that up, right? So it's not so much about the beauty of the words, but the content of the words. And in the first place, he's talking about the theological content, right? So he says, an inevitable fact is that all of this cannot be attained by a human himself. Okay, min tilqa'i nafsihi. Okay, from his own self. Let's say on his own, or something like that. Rather, it is revelation from the All-Knower, the All-Aware. Okay, no sensible person can doubt the veracity of one whom Allah informed of this knowledge. So that's not the wording we have here. من عرف الله تلك المعرفة. عفوا. تلك المعرفة, right? So من عرف الله تلك المعرفة. Let's see, just for interest, we'll listen back to how he read it.
إقامة البراهين القاطعة والحجج الواضحة والرد على أصناف الكفار، وذلك كله يعلم بالضرورة أنه لا يصل إليه بشر من تلقاء نفسه بل بوحي من العليم الخبير، ولا يشك عاقل في صدق من عرف الله تلك المعرفة وعظم جلاله ذلك التعظيم ودعا عباد الله إلى صراطه المستقيم.
Okay, so second taslam, but it's a kind of natural pause. We can excuse for that. So whoever knew Allah, had knowledge of Allah to that extent, or that kind of knowledge of Allah, that kind of gnosis of Allah. So it's not whom Allah informed of this knowledge. Who knew Allah to such an extent, or so wonderfully, so perfectly. Tilka al-ma'rifah, allows for a different kind of translations, right? You're not going to say one who knew Allah that knowledge, right? who exalted His Majesty with that greatness. Let's say so greatly. So we have here مفعول مطلق. من عرف الله معرفة المعرفة تلك المعرفة, right? So it's مفعول مطلق, it's in that position. And it's a way of saying, you know, to such an extent, in such a way, such a wonderful ma'rifah, such a wonderful ta'zim, right? To such an extent, to exalt His Majesty so greatly, and called the slaves of Allah to the straight path. Okay, so then the next one is also to do with content.
السابع ما شرع فيه من الأحكام وبين من الحلال والحرام وهدى إليه من مصالح الدنيا والآخرة وأرشد إليه من مكارم الأخلاق وذلك غاية الحكمة وثمرة العلوم. الثامن كونه محفوظا عن الزيادة والنقصان محروسا عن التبديل والتغيير على تطاول الأزمان بخلاف سائر الكتب. التاسع تيسيره للحفظ وذلك معلوم بالمعاينة. العاشر كونه لا يمله قارئه ولا سامعه على كثرة الترداد بخلاف سائر الكلام.
Okay, so the point there about the ahkam, so the guidance of the Quran, beside the theological, also legal and ethical and moral, all of that is a sign of, you know, of where this book is coming from. So how many times you've heard a dars, or you've just maybe read the ayat and it's come to you directly like that, that you know, subhanallah, this is such wisdom, this is such truth, you know, this is so perfect a system for human beings to live by. And when you hear it in that way and you appreciate the message, then you think this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is there a measure of subjectivity in that? You know, in some of these things, there's a measure of subjectivity which makes it difficult to be, like I said, set up a technical case for the mu'jiza. I'm saying something which increases your own iman and yaqeen in the source of this book being from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right. Eighth, it being protected from increase or decrease and guarded from changes and alteration for all of time, contrary to all other books. So in and of itself, I mean, so this has come up in the last few days, just ongoing debates on Twitter. But apart from, you know, the substance of the debates, one of the things that come up is people are saying, what's so miraculous if the Quran is preserved, right? Here Ibn Juzayy does seem to be suggesting that the preservation of the Quran is a miracle of the Quran. But in a way you understand that better when you say بِخِلَافِ سَائِرِ الْكُتُبِ. So insofar as that's different from how other books fared. Now, again, Sa'ir al-Kutub, is it talking about Sa'ir al-Kutub al-Samawiyya? Yes, most likely he's saying that. But if it's the case that other books, you know, can be preserved over time and even for 14 centuries, then the argument is not then sufficient in this way. You know, some further details would be needed to say, what is it about this preservation that you're saying is to the extent that it's miraculous? That's different from just saying the Quran is preserved. We need to know it's preserved because it's our authority, and we need to be able to say that what we have between our hands now is the same Quran that the Prophet ﷺ recited. That is an important question in itself. That's separate from the question of its preservation as a miracle, and that miracle is a hujjah ala al-alamin, right? Different point. Ninth is ease in memorization. So you're asking me ease in or ease of memorization. Neither one is like very English. It's ease of memorization, it's ease in memorization. Probably of is better, but how easy it is to memorize, that would be a clearer way of putting it, wouldn't it? وَذَلِكَ مَعْلُومٌ بِالْمُعَايَنَةِ. So it not just has been witnessed, but he's saying that you can see this, right? Go to your local kuttab or madrasa or whatever, and a maktab, and you will find children of a young age who memorize the Quran. And this is, again, he doesn't say here, بِخِلَافِ سَائِرِ الْكُتُبِ, right? So that's a sign of something special about the Quran, that it's easy to memorize. Again, an argument that is not that hard for someone to come with counters for, then you could further strengthen the argument. Perhaps there's something that could be convincing there. 10th, its quality of not boring its reciter nor its listener from excessive repetition. Not boring from contrary to all other discussions. So from, I might say, could be another word. Boring its reciter. You don't say nor unless you got neither. Not boring its reciter or its listener by excessive repetition. Again, like if you just worded the sentence differently, it might be, you know, that and there's no such thing as excessive repetition of the Quran, you see. So one can repeat the Quran, one can recite it and hear it over and over again and not get bored. That's what he's saying, and then we just need to find a good, nice, readable sentence saying that. Contrary to all other speech rather than discussions. Oh, you were suggesting due to here? That's fine, but I would need to recast the whole sentence, to be honest. Okay, so then we have Fada'il al-Quran. This is the 12th of 12. And here he is restricting it to a small selection of hadith regarding the virtues of the Quran, which are all in the Sahih collections. And he, he says some things that are generally about the Quran and then a few things about specific surahs. When you see the ones about specific surahs, you see how few Sahih hadiths there are in this particular bab, right? Not this bab of Ibn Juzayy, but in this, in this area, right? Hadiths pertaining to the fada'il of individual surahs. There are a few which are Sahih, and mostly these are weak or worse than weak. But in this selection, he's giving us the strongest of them.
يقول رحمه الله: الباب الثاني عشر في فضائل القرآن، وإنما نذكر منها ما ورد في الحديث الصحيح. فمن ذلك عن أبي أمامة الباهلي.
So this is فمن ذلك rather than they are. So what do these include? So you see how these include is very straightforward, as if of min dalik instead of and from that. Is anyone else experiencing the sound problem except for Yamin?
سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول: اقرأوا القرآن فإنه يأتي يوم القيامة شفيعا لأصحابه. وعن عائشة رضي الله عنها.
So what they've done here, they've included the Arabic text, which is nice. Not the norm in this book, but maybe because specifically some hadiths are being recorded, they've included the Arabic text. Okay, it is related to Abu Umama radiallahu anhu said, I heard the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam saying, recite the Quran because it will come on the day of rising as an intercessor for his companions. Now they have given a reference to a Tirmidhi. Our edition ascribes it to Muslim. And a subsequent hadith, our edition says is part of this hadith. So some of these narrations are sometimes collected together, connected within one hadith, and sometimes separated, which is not that unusual. But it may well be in a Tirmidhi and in Muslim. If it's in Muslim, then we'd ascribe it to Muslim. That would be the norm. There might be slight differences in the wording and things like that. So these things need to be checked before finalizing.
قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم: الماهر بالقرآن مع السفرة الكرام البررة والذي يقرأه ويتتعتع فيه وهو عليه شاق له أجران.
So here we have again in our edition, it is ascribed to Muslim. Okay, and they've said it is in Bukhari and Muslim. Which again could be true, but our edition is just telling us Muslim, right? So this one is very dear to me. This hadith is very dear to me, and the translation I'm actually happy with. I'm usually very unhappy with the way this is translated, because what happens is people write the person who's proficient with the Quran, that's al-mahir, is fine. I love this hadith so much that I named my son after this, the first guy, not the mutata'ati'. Right? The one who's proficient with the Quran is with the virtuous, noble scribes. And the one who reads it with difficulty, stammering in it, has 2 rewards. So my kunya is Abu Mahir, by the way. Nobody calls me that. Well, you can call me that if you want. The virtuous, noble scribes. And the one who reads it with difficulty, stammering in it, has 2 rewards. So that's exactly what the hadith says. Lahu ajran. This one usually gets spread around. And there is like one of the translations of Sahih Muslim. I think that's where the problem arose. It says he will have a double reward. He will have a double reward. This is the one who stammers and finds it difficult. Then you have versions of it where somebody has got excited when they were typing it up and they've written, he will have twice that reward. And I shout because they've written it in caps as well, in cap lock, right? He will have twice that reward. And what they've now imposed on the meaning of the hadith is that the person who has difficulty with it will have twice the reward of the mahir, who was mentioned at the beginning. How many of you have heard this? How many of you think, or are now starting to doubt because the rant that is coming, how many of you have thought that that's what it means? Okay, but you have to think about it for a minute. Okay, I'm waiting for some confessions here in the chat box. So this always seemed very strange to me, and I think it was, in fact, I was reading in a book by Sheikh al-Husari. He corrected this notion, so maybe at that point my thought about it was corrected. But what that indicates then, if we took it in that way, double the reward of the first person, it would mean, first of all, that there's virtue in stammering in its own right. Whereas what is intended is there's virtue in persevering. And so you find it difficult and you keep going. You will not only be rewarded for the letters that you recite, you'll be rewarded for the effort, the perseverance, not giving up. Okay? So it's 2 rewards. It doesn't mean two hasanas, right? Lahu ajran. So he will have 1 ajr in full and another ajr in full. This is not a comparison with al-mahir. Al-mahiru bil-Qur'an ma'a as-safaratil kiram al-barara. What does that mean? It could mean his reward is written with the writing angels. But I prefer to understand this as meaning the one who recites the Quran proficiently, al-mahiru bil-Qur'an, not just someone who has fluent recitation, right? But someone who lives the Quran. The fluency of their recitation leads them to recite morning and night, because they get pleasure from that. And they perhaps are learning its meanings, living by it. All of that would have to be included for someone to be called al-mahiru bil-Quran. We would not apply such a beautiful name to someone who just like is fluent in reciting but lives against the Quran. Then he's not ma'as safaratil kiram al-barara. But the person who is like a Quranic person, who has reached a level of attainment, right? That person is like one of the angels, right? The angels who are entrusted with receiving the revelation and writing it down and conveying it to the messengers. Okay, so it's such an honor to, for a person to reach this stage, al-mahiru bil-Quran, and it's not just an overnight thing. Ma'as safaratil kiram al-barara. Now, ask yourself this: how does a person become mahir or mahira bil-Quran? How does a person attain this rank? Okay, you may say, by divine gift. Sure, that's always going to be correct. But if you mean the person didn't make any effort, Allah Azza wa Jalla just gave them that skill and that tawfiq to learn the Quran, to know it, and to live by it, yeah, that may indeed be true for some people. But most of the time, a person who reaches the level of being mahir or mahira bil Quran, they went through all that struggle, didn't they? So they started off, they found it difficult, they stammered, and they persevered, and they got the double reward, they got the 2 rewards, they kept going, and then they became good, and they became skillful and proficient. Now, according to the mafhum, the mafhum of what we said at the beginning about this double reward, and a bunch of you have admitted to understanding it this way. Let's see. You heard it several times from very reputable du'at. Yeah, me too. And I correct them on Twitter. Reward of reading. So twice the reward of reading, but not reaching the maqam of iman. Yeah, correct. Okay. The commentators, by the way, because you mentioned the commentators, there is actually, that view is mentioned. You know, some have mentioned it, but others have responded to it. So if you look in the Sharh of An-Nawawi, you would find him mention the other view, ascribes it to someone, I forget who, but he sides against that, right? So I'm siding with An-Nawawi, not the other way around, not to get things mixed up. So I'm siding with An-Nawawi. The problem would be, if a person is getting double for stammering, that means they get half of that reward for being a mahir, right? So now you see the problem. A person is getting the double reward, and then they become a mahir, so it's cut in half. هذا ظلم مبين, right? It's impossible. It's impossible that the mahir has half the reward of the mutata'ati' or the muta'ati', according to the narration that we're dealing with. So it is impossible that the mahir has got half the reward. Although that's not the wording of the hadith, but if that's the idea that you have, that is twice that reward, as some people have translated it, then it would mean the mahir has half of that reward. And it would mean you should never get past the stage of stammering. You should stammer. Billati hi ahsan. Stammer. Hatta heen. Hatta ya'tiyaka al-yaqeen. Stammer forever. Okay? And you don't, iyaka. Should avoid ever getting too good, because you'll miss out on those sweet, sweet rewards of making the mistakes. It doesn't work like that. This is an encouragement for the person who's finding it difficult. It's a beautiful encouragement. But let's talk more about the mahir as well. Like, let's not forget the poor old mahir. Wa ana Abu Mahir. Right? We mentioned that at the beginning, that we just pass right over that and we go straight to وَالَّذِي يَقْرَأُهُ وَيَتَتَعْتَعُ فِيهِ وَهُوَ عَلَيْهِ شَاقٌ. Right? That's usually why we cite this hadith, and for good reason. But we should also be celebrating the idea of being mahir bil Quran, right? Which is not a word that you hear talked about that much. It should be even amongst Ahlul Quran. I was taught that lahu ajran means they have 2 sources of rewards: the recitation, having sabr. Yeah, this is what we said. Okay. Hopefully we'll clear that up once and for all. So if you see anyone types the twice that reward, tell them not twice that reward, twice their own reward. Let's see.
وعن أبي موسى الأشعري رضي الله عنه قال: قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم: مثل المؤمن الذي يقرأ القرآن كمثل الأترجة ريحها طيب وطعمها طيب، ومثل المؤمن الذي لا يقرأ القرآن مثل التمرة لا ريح لها وطعمها حلو، ومثل المنافق الذي يقرأ القرآن مثل الريحانة ريحها طيب وطعمها مر، ومثل المنافق الذي لا يقرأ القرآن كمثل الحنظلة ليس لها ريح وطعمها مر.
Okay. So here, this is ascribed in the footnote to Al-Bukhari and Muslim. And he says here, وَاللَّفْظُ لَهُ, i.e., that is to say, the wording is from Muslim. So in that case, this should say Muslim. Unless there's a difference in the wording between what we have in this translation and what we have in our edition that we're looking at. But it sounded like it looks like the same. So the 4 things, of course, there's that which is fragrant and sweet. The first time I met an utruj, Okay, I'd heard the word Utruj. There's an institute in London called the Utruj Institute, but I didn't know what Utruj was. But I met an Utruj one day when I was doing a friendly visit to a synagogue in Edinburgh. So the Jewish people there were celebrating one of their festivals, I think the sort of harvest festival that they have. And they had this thing, it looks like a lemon. If I recall, it's a bit bigger than a lemon. And they said, this is an etrog. So I got my spidey senses tingling. Etrog, utruj, right? Same thing, right? And funnily enough, they've got a tradition, sort of rabbinical tradition, that says something very similar to the kind of structure of this hadith. It is not about reciting the Quran or not reciting the Quran, but the kind of categories are very similar, okay? So that was an interesting point. But it's fragrant, and it's called a citron. It's called a citron. Whose scent is fragrant and whose taste is sweet. So not like a lemon. It looks like a lemon, but it tastes different. The likeness of the believer who does not recite the Quran is like that of the date, which has no scent, but whose taste is sweet. So they're good on the inside, but they're not sending out the fragrance of recitation. The likeness of the hypocrite who recites the Quran is like that of basil, okay, raihana, whose scent is fragrant, but his taste is bitter. We still like it, bitter things can be nice, with tomato in a sandwich or something like that, mozzarella. The likeness of the hypocrite who does not recite the Quran. Of course, we don't like hypocrites. I'm talking about basil. I'm not talking about hypocrites. The likeness of the hypocrite who does not recite the Quran is like the simile of the colecanth, which has no scent and whose taste is bitter. If you don't know what a colecanth is, well, maybe more like, okay. Some translate this as a bitter gourd. Okay, these are all sort of circular ones. But the handhala is sometimes more like, in the subcontinent, we call it karela. I translate this hadith as karela here because like it has no scent, whose taste is bitter. Like you have to have it's a developed taste really, karela. Yeah, so it's the kind of thing our parents and grandparents might like, and young people generally not so much. So if your name is Handhala, well, it's just it's a nice name, okay, because there's great Sahaba who are called Handhala. But here, the actual Handhala is associated with this trait, which is that it has no scent. There's no recitation of the Quran, and if you bite into it, it's bitter. Depends on how you cook it. Yeah, stuff it with keema, it's going to be tolerable at most.
وعن عبد الله بن مسعود رضي الله عنه قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم استذكروا القرآن فلهو أشد تفصيا من صدور الرجال من النعم بعقولها.
Okay, it is related from Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiallahu anhu that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, try to remember the Quran. Okay, as you keep it memorized, because it is certainly more likely to escape from the breasts of people than camels do from their hobbling cords. I don't know why necessarily hobbling cords. It could be more like their reins or their ties, or I will look up hobbling cords and see if there's a good reason to use that particular description. The more likely is okay, but I would say it tends more to escape. It is more. There's different ways of wording this. So a sort of fancy way to say in English, it's more want to escape, which is the WONT. But that's a little bit sort of archaic and maybe not the way of putting it in our inclined to escape, liable to escape, which is similar to likely, which is what they already put. Okay, so I'll keep it as it is for now and then consider. Yes, likely is what they wrote already. And then this hadith is, again, it's in Bukhari and Muslim, but the wording is Muslim. So, you could write Bukhari and Muslim, or you could write Muslim if the wording is more specifically from that source.
وعن عثمان بن عفان أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه.
It is related from Uthman radiallahu anhu that the Messenger said, the best are those who learn the Quran and who teach it. So typically the word who wouldn't be in the translation, learn the Quran and teach it. There's no problem with the word who here. I'm just going to lose it anyway. Because it's not going to be sort of one or the other. You have to learn the Quran in order to teach it. So I think that meaning comes across clearer if you don't have the word who. To learn the Quran and teach it. Okay, so learning the Quran and teaching it shouldn't be restricted, by the way, to learning its recitation. Okay, tajweed, and of course that is included. But learning the Quran, everything that the Quran is, and teaching everything the Quran is to others, they should be understood in its broadest sense. So this is in Al-Bukhari. One of the funniest things I remember seeing in Egypt, and I saw a lot of funny things in Egypt. I was in one center, a newly established center for Arabic studies and Islamic studies, and they've written on the wall, they've written, خَيْرُكُمْ مَنْ تَعَلَّمَ الْقُرْآنَ وَعَلَّمَهُ. Beautiful sort of calligraphy. Then under it they'd written, صَحَحَهُ الْأَلْبَانِي. So I remember scratching my head like, I'm pretty sure Sahih al-Bukhari, I don't think that we needed Al-Albani to come along later. But they went to all the trouble of writing this on the wall, and subhanallah, it's a hadith al-Bukhari. Okay.
عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إن الله يرفع بهذا القرآن أقواما ويضع به آخرين. وعن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما قال.
So this one again subscribe to Tirmidhi, and we have a reference here to Muslim. So again, it's probably in all these sources, but he's made a point of using Sahih hadith. Of course, a Sahih hadith can be in a Tirmidhi, but the point is when you write that it's in Muslim, you got a greater, more immediate sense. So this is a Sahih hadith, that's all. Yes.
بينما جبريل قاعد عند النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم سمع نقيضا من فوقه.
Now, I don't know why it's worded like this, that Umar said, your prophet did indeed say. So that is not the wording in our edition. That could be the wording of a Tirmidhi, but it's not the wording that is given to us here. أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال.
رفع رأسه قال هذا باب من السماء فتح اليوم ولم يفتح قط إلا اليوم فنزل منه ملك فقال هذا ملك نزل إلى الأرض لم ينزل قط إلا اليوم.
So at this point, the hadith now are pertaining to specific surahs.
سلم عليه وقال أبشر بنورين أوتيتهما لم يؤتهما نبي قبلك فاتحة الكتاب وخواتم سورة البقرة لن تقرأ بحرف منهما إلا أعطيته.
Okay. So I would like to check the interpretation here, but this is plausible, but I just like to check what the shurrah say about that. Of course, just as we have a genre of explaining the Quran, which is called Tafsir, Tafsir al-Quran, we have a genre explaining a hadith, which is shuruh, right, of the hadith. They're not exactly parallel in their methods and so on, but one should respect the shuruh and the shurrah of the hadith and not just take hadiths at face value. We should look into what the ulama have said, just as we do when reading the Quran and explaining it.
وعن أبي مسعود الأنصاري رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من قرأ هاتين الآيتين من آخر سورة البقرة في ليلة كفتاه. وعن أبي أمامة.
So there's a hadith then missing from this translation.
رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال اقرأوا البقرة فإن أخذها بركة وتركها حسرة ولا يستطيعها البطلة. وعن أبي هريرة.
Now, I noticed this earlier, so I've highlighted it. Okay, so this, in our footnote, it says this is the hadith at the start of the bab. Okay. Here, when they provided it, they've got this extra wording. Again, I don't know if that is in some editions of Ibn Juzayy or whether they have sort of copied and pasted this from somewhere else. But in our edition, there's no mention of this point. But it's an explanation from, it just says here Muawiyah, and they've written Muawiyah ibn Salam. So again, you can't just translate Qala Muawiyah with Muawiyah ibn Salam said. You'd have to put, this in square brackets. Yes, the Arabic is over here says tastati'uha, and this is yastati'uha. So I did a quick search for this earlier, and I found that tastati'uha is the wording that seems to be common in the narrations. Yastati'uha would be certainly possible anyway, so there may be some of the narrations have it in that way. In any case, this meaning of al-batala, which is here coming from one of the rawis, should be the right interpretation anyway. As-sahara, al-batala is the people of falsehood who destroy things, and they are the sorcerers. So they've said the enchanters are not up to it. So it would be like they cannot overcome it. It would be something along these lines, right? So they cannot overcome Surah Al-Baqarah.
رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال لا تجعلوا بيوتكم مقابر إن الشيطان يفر من البيت الذي تقرأ فيه سورة البقرة.
Okay, so there's a difference in the wording here as well. ينفر and يفر. So I'm wondering what they've done here in terms of the wording. Did they look up these hadiths and find a wording from elsewhere and paste it into the Ibn Juzayy document? Or did they get this from the Ibn Juzayy edition that they were using? They should not just paste it from elsewhere, because then you get different wordings, you get issues from that. Okay. They should keep the wording that's in Ibn Juzayy, but then note any inconsistencies between that and the books of hadith, the authoritative books of hadith. And here I'm trusting that the tahqiq that we're reading has preserved Ibn Juzay's wording. Okay. In the shaitana yanfiru or yafiru. Let's see. Yafiru is the wording that we've got in our edition. Shaitan flees from the meaning is going to be the same anyway. Flees from the house in which Surah Al-Baqarah is recited.
ابن كعب رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يا أبا المنذر أتدري أي آية من كتاب الله معك أعظم؟ قلت الله ورسوله أعلم. قال يا أبا المنذر أتدري أي آية من كتاب الله معك أعظم؟ قلت الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم. قال فضرب في صدري وقال ليهنك العلم يا أبا المنذر. وعن النواس بن سمعان قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول يؤتى بالقرآن يوم القيامة وأهله الذين كانوا يعملون به تقدمه سورة البقرة وآل عمران.
Okay. يؤتى بالقرآن وأهله. The Quran will be brought on the day of rising and its people. So you'd have to use a word that connects, its people to it. The Quran will be brought, like along with its people who used to act by it.
وضرب لهما رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم 3 أمثال ما نسيتها بعد. قال: كأنهما غمامتان أو ظلتان سوداوان بينهما شرق أو كأنهما فرقان من طير صواف تحاجان عن صاحبهما.
Okay. So one who recited them is a bit of an interpretation, because the Sahib of these surahs could be one who recited them, okay, but it's more likely to be those who memorized them. And he says here, وَأَهْلِهِ الَّذِينَ كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ بِهِ. So it would imply also there are people who lived by them, okay? But I would understand it as people who memorized them and were sincere in their efforts.
وعن أبي الدرداء رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: من حفظ 10 آيات من أول سورة الكهف عصم من الدجال. وعن أبي الدرداء رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: سورة قل هو الله أحد تعدل ثلث القرآن.
Okay, so sometimes a surah is known by a phrase in it. So the description of this particular surah, Al-Ikhlas, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ seems to be really Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad.
وعن عقبة بن عامر رضي الله عنه قال: قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم: ألم تر آيات أنزلت علي لم ير مثلهن قط قل أعوذ برب الفلق وقل أعوذ برب الناس.
Okay. Did you not see verses that were sent down upon me during the night, the like of which have never been seen? Okay, so then he mentioned the Mu'awwidhatayn, or the last 2 surahs, by the first words of those surahs. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the 12 abwab in Al-Muqaddimat Al-Ula. We won't be going into the going through the next section, at least not now, but this is just it to have a look at it. Al-Muqaddimat Al-Thaniya, we've got here في تفسير معاني اللغات. Okay, so he mentions here that in this section he has got words which appear multiple times in the Quran. Okay, أو تقع فيه في موضعين فأكثر, right? So it might be multiple times, or just maybe two or more. Various types of words. Why has he done this? He explains that he's done it تيسيرها للحفظ, right? So the first thing is, it would be worth taking these introductory explanations, just memorizing the definitions, right? Something I've long wanted to do, never really got around to doing, was just to take a short Quranic dictionary and just memorize it. If you've got time to do that, go ahead, use Ibn Juzayy if you want, or I can suggest other possibilities. فإنها وقعت في القرآن متفرقة فجمعها أسهل لحفظها. Right? So once you've got the meaning, then you can remember it when you encounter that word in different places in the Quran. And that word may have several meanings in different contexts. And that's what we said before, is al-wujuh wal-nadha'ir fi al-Quran. The second, ليكون هذا الباب كالأصول الجامعة لمعاني التفسير. So since tafsir is first and foremost the meaning of words, individual words, once you have got that, then later on you can focus on talking about other levels of the tafsir, right? So the meanings of the individual words is kind of covered for the most part by this muqaddimah. كما أن التواليف القراءات جمعت فيها الأصول المضطردة والكثيرة الدور. So he mentioned before about the qira'at and how we have this thing called usul, where you have the principles, you learn those principles and the rules, and then that applies across the board. And then you've got something called farsh, which is more the things that don't have a regular pattern. The second, al-ikhtisar. This is to save space later on in the tafsir, that he doesn't have to always explain the words. You are expected to go back to the lughat. Sometimes he tells you, we have explained this in the lughat. Right? When he says fil lughat, he means over here in this introduction. But a lot of times he won't say that, but the information is actually here in the lughat. And sometimes he will just repeat the meaning in its place, right? So that's not an absolute rule that he won't mention it, or will always seek to be concise later on. Okay. وربما نبهنا على بعضها للحاجة إلى ذلك. That's what he says himself here. ورتبناها في هذا الباب على حروف المعجم. فمن لم يجد تفسير كلمة في موضعها من القرآن فلينظرها في هذا الباب. Okay, so you might not find it in the tafsir, so come back here, look alphabetically. The alphabetical system he's using is the Maghribi one, so you're going to find quite a difference in that, right? Maybe I can show you using the contents page at the back. Let me see. Yeah, I'll show you that. So first we'll just look at a quick example so you see what it looks like. So he talks about the word ayah, two meanings of the word ayah. He talks about ata, then he talks about ata, then he talks about aba ya'ba, athar, and then ithm, ajr. So under the hamza, he's mentioned them in order of their occurrence in the Quran. So it's not in complete alphabetical order, rather it's in the order of how they're coming in Surah Al-Baqarah. So that's a bit of a tricky thing to navigate and to find sometimes. So let me show you the alphabetical order that we're dealing with. If you're not Maghribi, this will take a bit of getting used to. So Hamza, Ba, Ta, Tha, Jim, Ha, Kha, Dal, Dhal, Ra, Za. Okay, so far so good. And then from Za we go Ta, Dha, Kaf, Lam, Mim, Noon. That's familiar sequence. And Sad, Dad, Ain, Ghain, Fa, Qaf. But Kaf has already been before. Sin, Sheen, Ha, Waw, Ya. Okay, so don't be too surprised if you're looking through alphabetically and you struggle to find. Then you just have to remember we're dealing with a Maghribi order. طيب, so we're going to conclude here our session on our sessions on the introductions of Ibn Juzayy in Usul al-Tafsir on Al-Quran. I hope it's been beneficial. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.